Yo, before we start talking about what I do to critically think a walk around and engine inspection prior to flight, I wanted to tell you this. This YouTube channel is solely dedicated for any revenue that we receive, we give away to organizations like the Baja Dog Rescue. My wife and I are very passionate about rescuing dogs. We have 4 dogs that would not otherwise have a home if it wasn't for our ability to be able to take them in. My wife and I were both flight nurses, and we are very passionate about aviation and rescuing dogs. So anything that we get, any revenue, you guys can help us by hitting the like, subscribe button. We ended up giving all that stuff away. Although the chances of us actually getting anything are very slim, that is my contribution to help the rescue dogs. And that is something that we feel very strongly about. So if you guys get on board, that'd be awesome. If you help us, we can help them. Thanks. Well, my wife was supposed to be here to help hold the camera, but I guess I'm going to do it myself. Initially, when I walk up to the airplane, it's like an assessment. I kind of just look at it, general overbeing, kind of get that from our profession. And being flight nurses, when we look at patients, we look at them from across the room. Are they sick? Are they dying? Are they not? Are they healthy? Whatever. You can tell a lot just by looking. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. So as you walk up to your airplane, you kind of look for oil spots on the ground. Those are old. Those are new. Those are not normally there. This plane usually doesn't leak oil or grease. So for me, that's a big red flag. I understand if you're borrowing other people's airplanes or you have a flight school airplane that's always leaking, it's a little harder to do that, but you can still look for a general overall impression as you walk up to the airplane. If you're lucky enough to have cowlings that can be opened, sometimes these systems are a little confusing, and it's a little hard to understand where these wirings and these tubes are going. My advice to do a good walk around and a good pre-flight inspection of the engine is to understand the airplane that you're flying and the systems that it has. That way you know where these all the wirings go, what they're going to, what they're being used for, and I'll give you an example. So these are oil lines for us. When we first bought this plane, my brother and I traced this back and actually found one of these oil lines being chafed kind of back here a little bit. And so that oil line was being chafed enough where it actually rubbed about 1/3 of the way through the insulation. Had it continued, it may have been a bad situation, but we were able to find it. So coming a little closer in here, if you look at these wires, one day I just followed these wires and I'm looking for any chafing or any potential chafing. These all look pretty solid. They're separated, they're zip tied. And then I was kind of coming around to this right here, and I noticed that this little spark plug wire was actually rubbing against. You can see the silver polish right there, and it's really hard to see on the video, but there's actually some chafing that was happening from the spark plug wire. So we kind of set it back a little bit, and we were able to prevent that chafing from happening. So follow those wires, look for anything that could be rubbing against each other, rubbing on something else, and just overall kind of like torque to bolts. I'll show you what I'm talking about next. So speaking of torque to bolts, I noticed that it's really easy to spot in this plane because it doesn't leak any oil. I noticed the other flight, I had some oil that was leaking down right there and kind of coming down here. So after tracking it back, I noticed that this guy right there, let's see if I can point it out a little bit better. It's really hard to get in here. So I noticed that this right here, the oil is dripping down right here and then dripping down and then blowing, or getting on the cowling and then blowing down. So I noticed that over time, that clamp right here kind of worked its way loose. Not a huge deal because that's an oil return line, because I know the systems in this airplane pretty well, and it doesn't take rocket scientists to figure that one out. But just be aware of things like that. I know that rubber can get old and cracked, but I just went ahead and tightened it. I'm going to wipe off all the evidence of the oil and take it for a flight and see if it continues. A lot of time coloring can really mean something significant is happening. So when I'm looking at this engine, I'm looking for coloring. I'm looking for grease, I'm looking for dirt, I'm looking for oil. I'm also looking for exhaust. I'll show you what I mean right here. So I'm looking for these joints right there. You don't need the light. You can see that there's some exhaust coming out of that that joint, that mating surface right here and right there. These are the exhaust pipes and these intakes, and you can kind of see maybe a little bit coming out of this JPI EGT sensor. But overall, the coloring or discoloring from something or a piece of metal that can actually tell you a lot too. So coming around to the co-pilot side, it's hard to sometimes track down oil leaks. So there's another thing that I noticed. This is a couple years ago. If you get closer to the exhaust manifold, you can see this right here. So that's kind of funny looking. It's something was burning. And so what it ended up being was oil dripping from these seals. I had cork seals in here. We've since replaced them with rubber seals. This bolt, one of these bolts was over tightened or whatever, was actually leaking oil to the lowest point, dripping on the spark plug and then dripping right down onto that manifold. So it's really important when you do see something like that, that's evidence of something happening. And you really should be tracing that back to you know, the problem, because if one of those bolts became completely loose and started leaking a shit ton of oil out there, you might find yourself an in-flight issue or having an in-flight issue. Probably not, because it's really not that serious of an issue, but I'm just saying, being a detective is a good thing. So let's go to fuel. Fuel lines leak, and sometimes you're lucky enough to catch them, sometimes you're lucky enough to find out afterwards. This is where knowing your systems really does help. We had the fuel servo replaced on this airplane, and everything was fine, but I always double check and make sure that when I get a new part, the safety wire is in the correct direction, and make sure that nothing has rotated. Here's the fuel servo down here. I'll try to get you close. And so I give all these bolts an inspection, make sure that nothing's backing off. Something like this right here, you can kind of see that little nut washer, that is always in the same position. And just general things like that. I'm not a mechanic by any means, but if it was like that when they put it in and it's not backing out, no bolts are turning, and everything looks like it's still torqued, and that's always a good thing. One other thing I wanted to mention too, as far as fuel goes, like this is where knowing your systems helps. You can see that this goes to the fuel pressure sensor in the panel, and so just by inspecting and seeing like if there's any blue dye or any kind of like extra dirt deposits around there might indicate that there might be something leaking. Same thing on this side, and then it's a little hard with the cowling on and stuff to go back to the fuel spider, but that's something great to do. The devil's in the details. Sometimes the mechanics don't have the time to inspect all the little things, so if you're there when the cowling's off, you can kind of walk through and understand more of the systems of your airplane. That way it's easier to spot when something's going wrong. Also, what I like to do is before every pre-flight, I like to get my hands in there and look at the spark plug caps. So you can twist these little bad boys here. A lot of times, these are only supposed to be torqued very loosely. So if you're able to kind of just get in there and just make sure that those are at least finger tight, that's going to be a really helpful thing. And it just kind of gets you in there to just look at things, and you never know, just by hitting something with your hand, sometimes you dislodge something or back something out, or something moves that you wouldn't otherwise have known just by touching it. So the other thing too, we'll go to the next video. So I want to talk about cowling. I mean, not cowling, the baffling in the cowling. It's very important that seals well, and by inspecting your baffling and making sure that it's actually making contact on your cowling, if you're lucky enough, I guess, to have a cowling that does open, that's significant. I found a tiny little, maybe a quarter size hole years ago that actually ended up leading to cylinder number 5 getting about 50 degrees hotter. I'm talking like 430, 440 degrees total, while the others were about 380, 390 on takeoff. And here, I'll turn you around, and this is all that was causing that problem. So right here on the passenger side, you can see we kind of puttied it up, but there is just a little bit of a gap right through there. And so when the cowling is closed, this actually seals it and the hole is not there. But I mean, it's about as big as my thumbnail, maybe. And just that air blowing by and getting past that rather than going down through the cylinder caused about a 40 degree discrepancy. If we wouldn't have had a JPI engine monitor, we wouldn't have known about it, and that cylinder may have overheated at some point in time, weakened the metal, and blown off. So very important. Just make sure that baffling is sealing well, and by doing a good pre-flight inspection, just really using your head about how lines should be matching up, and if lines aren't matching up, maybe that should throw a red flag if something is rubbing or isn't rubbing, or it looks like it, like in baffling, like if it isn't clamping or closing. And let me show you this other thing with baffling. You can very like lightly see this kind of wear pattern right here, and that means that it's chafing in a good way. And I cleaned all this, so you can't see it, but there used to be red chafe marks on that on the cowling there, indicating that it is making contact, and good contact, with the cowling. So it's actually sealing well, keeping the cylinders cool. So here's a prime example of what I was talking about, of having like everything bend a certain way. If it looks like it's kinked, like a wire, if you come up to a wire, not just in general, just in life, you come up to a wire, you're inspecting something and it's like super kinked, you know, that could later on fracture that wire. I found this the other day. This is actually when we were taking the fuel servo off, and I'll show you right here. This hose is kind of resting right on top of, it's really hard for you guys to see, but this hose, oh, there you go. See, it started to tear. And so this was actually forcing down on that hose. I still have to replace that. It's benign. Talk to a mechanic about it. But you can see that, you know, when things get too close and they start to chafe, you know, these airplanes vibrate quite a bit. So even a little bit of contact between two objects can really create some big problems later down the road. And by no means is this going to be an exhaustive list. If there's something that you do that you didn't see me do, leave it in the comments below. I'm just kind of firing from my hip as far as this goes, and just kind of taking you guys around and hitting the major points that I've found over the years. And I may have skipped over something later in this video, I'll realize it. But anyways, yeah, I mean, it's not an exhaustive list. So going back to the discoloration of certain objects, it's very important to pay attention to, because that can mean something. And in this case, we got the connector that basically connects most of the engine controls, monitors, things like that. It runs through the firewall. I noticed it was maybe about a month ago or so, and I'm going to get this looked at by a mechanic, that there's a lot of discoloring of the wires, like discoloring as in like they're getting hot. So I'm going to show you right now what I mean. So we're coming up as the pilot side, and I forgot what this connector is called. Maybe somebody else can refresh my memory, but you can see this connector here. And if we get in close enough, let's see if I can zoom in, you can see that there's quite a bit of discoloration. It looks like maybe it's a browning or something like that of the wires. It actually looks a lot worse on video. Anyways, but that was something that I thought was noteworthy, because the color of the wires are supposed to be white and yellow, some of them, and they're starting to turn brown. So I don't know if they're getting too hot. I don't know, but definitely something that I picked up on. And just by looking at the possibilities, like the wires are all together, they all have current going through it, and they all have a potential to get hot. So that's something that I would like, when I see a group of wires like that together, I look at extra carefully. So as I had the cowling open, like I mentioned before about the baffling, this side actually has the marks. So I can see that the baffling is sealing very well, and it is chafing right here. It still looks like it's in great condition. You come over here, as this closes, this edge folds over this edge, and these edges, you know, they're not crinked or over, you know, folded over each other. So when this cowling does come down, it will actually create a good seal. Something else too that I wanted to really emphasize is that when you're doing your pre-flight, get your hands on some of these cords and wires. Like move these things around. You can kind of see that's chafing a little bit right here. Not a big deal. Those things are really thick, and that's supposed to be loose. You know, I mean, don't really like try to break something, but you know, try to make sure that everything's tight the way that it should be. And then look at these engine mounts. You know, if they're cracked, can't really see engine mount that well, but make sure that, you know, the engine mounts aren't cracked, and every bolt has like some thread popping up out of it, or, you know, like, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Just the little things like this. Just like, see this bolt? Like it's like this nut isn't at the end. It's not backed all the way down. It's secure. It's the way it should be. This one right there, at least it's secure, but it's at the end. These aren't completely backed out. And then, you know, just certain things like you're looking for fluid, you're looking for a little dirt. These airplanes keep flying around. What do they think this is, an airport? I'm just kidding, it is an airport. And also this, the torque seal is a big deal. So right here, you can see that yellow torque seal. It's still intact. Oh, sorry. It's still intact. And I put torque seal when I did these injectors right here, and that's still intact right there. If you do see torque seal and it's broken, that's a big red flag too. You might want to check that out before you go take that flying at least. You know, the important bolts, try to go in with your finger like the oil filter. I always give it a good crank just to make sure it's tight. And that's just something that knowing your systems on your airplane is going to help you a lot with. And I said that before, but I swear that's probably the biggest thing. The biggest benefit of understanding your airplane and how it's made and where all that shit goes to, so you know if there's a problem or the areas that you want to focus on to actually inspect. Because some of the heater stuff, like, it's, you know, unless there's an exhaust manifold or muffler that's cracked, I really don't care too much about like some of these orange, like these, you know, if they get brittle or cracked, I really don't care that much about it. But if I have a chafing in an oil line, I definitely want to know. I want to make sure that this rubber's still on there. That way it's not chafing on that. I want to make sure that that's tight and all these are making a good seal. And when you don't know the systems of the airplane or how to work on these things, you don't have to be an expert, because I'm not. But it really does help to know to pick your mechanic's brain about where these things go. That way you can inspect them. And we've owned this for about 8 years, and that's the biggest thing, is me getting involved in the maintenance in this has really helped me do my pre-flight safely. Because you open this up and I mean, it's like a rat's nest of wires, cables, tubes, bolts, oil leaks. You don't know which one's bad, which one's unsafe, you know. So know what you're looking at before you open the cowling. You know, have somebody show you around and trace all of these, because it's really, really going to help you. All right, so continuing on with the walk around. You know, I know you have a checklist for this stuff, but just try to think outside the box. That's why I'm going to try to show you guys what I do. Looking at my prop, I think we overfilled it at the annual because we got a little grease on the backside. You can kind of see at the right angle, there's a little bit of grease. Not a big deal, but I'm definitely going to keep an eye on it. Coming around here, you can see this on the spinner. There is a little bit of trauma right here. There's no dent or anything like that, but if something hit that, and I know the secret, I know what happened, I'm not going to get into that, but actually a plane hit me. A Diamond DA-40 wingtip hit that. But I mean, if it was big enough to scuff the paint on that spinner, then was it hard enough impact to bend that spinner and bend the screw, so when the propeller's spinning, the spinner is doing this? And if it does that, if it does wobble, does it throw off the harmonics that go through the crank? So I had a car throw a crank because of a harmonic, so that's why I think about that. Also, if we're going to be looking here, I had somebody, actually an A&P, point this out to me. This needs to be stop drilled. So before it splits, and that does up there too. So you're looking for any cracks. It's not an unsafe situation, but you know, at the same time, you want to make sure that everything's dialed in. Continuing at the front here, there was one day that I was checking the tension on the alternator belt and it was loose. It wasn't loose because it just was like, it wasn't meant to be loose. It was loose because there's a bolt backing out from the alternator. So because of that, I was able to get that fixed. But on this Comanche, there's a belt right here, and you kind of get a good feel for it. You know, I mean, it's not science, but the more that you put your hands in there and realize the tension of something, you know when something is going wrong, or, you know, isn't as tight as it should be, like that alternator belt. All right, let's do just the general impression of your airplane when you walk up to it. You can see, well, you can't see, I can see, that when you get close, this strut right here is sagging, and that is fully pumped up. This strut I've noticed. Come walk over here under the wing with me. We've got a little dirt accumulation right there on the oleo. That tells me that maybe that seal is not very good. And that probably needs to be recharged with whatever they put in there. I kind of forget. So all that stuff means something. Oh, you know, I got to get back under there. I wanted to point this stuff out too. Do you see the dirt right here? There's some Zerk fittings right here. So there's dirt accumulating because of the grease. This isn't really something that I'm concerned about because it's just the rod. But, you know, if something that articulates, like right here, gets enough grease and dirt buildup, it might get sticky and not work as well. That's loose. So, you know, it's just something to always be looking for. Sometimes these planes are neglected, and there is a 1,000-hour AD on this gear, but all those things are evidence of something building. If you have dirt around a fitting that's not supposed to be leaking, like that seal, that's an indication that seal's going bad. So cumulatively, all this stuff can add up to be something pretty significant. So like I said before, the POH, everybody has checklists of what to look for during the walk around. I'm trying to illustrate maybe some critical thinking in some areas that I've discovered after 8 years of ownership that I can kind of pass along that have been valuable. And so when you look at an airplane, look at the skin. Don't just go around it. You know, if there's a scratch or a dent, make sure it's not causing an issue with something else, like this. This happened before we bought the airplane, but you can see a little hanger rash right here that was repaired. No big deal, it's benign. But you know what, I'm concerned, and every time I look at these little pinch points, they cause pressure somewhere else in that skin. So when I do my pre-flight, I make sure that there's no cracking, because if you get a cracked surface or crack on a surface like this, it can split very easily. And we had one on the trim tab in the stabilator I'll show you. So during our walk around, static wick is good. This one's hanging down. That's just slowing me down. There's also another ding right there that's going to be putting pressure on the skin of the aircraft. So for me, and I know it's a little harder if you rent or something like that, things always change. You know, there's new scratches all the time, but it's just something to be aware of because those can lead to big problems. Keep an eye on them. So like what I was saying earlier, was that with this trim tab, there was a pinch point. Something got pinched on the trailing edge of the trim tab right here. And when it got pinched, it created a stress mark in the metal. And over time, that started off as a small crack, then became a little bit bigger. I didn't know this, but when you have a trim tab with a crack in it, it is a big deal. Piper does not allow us to stop drill these, so I had to find a trim tab for this particular plane and used out of a junkyard. It was like $900 plus paint, plus install. Very, very expensive. So these services are so expensive. And over the years, I was keeping an eye on that little crack. And once my A&P, not years, but over the year, once my A&P saw that at the annual, he was like, stop, can't do it. If that splits, you basically lose control of the airplane. And I didn't know that. So also on the same stabilator, during a walk around, I look for tiny little things as well because they could be big problems. Knowing after that trim tab started separating, I started taking a closer look. And I wash and wax this thing quite a bit. I just noticed this a little while ago. I thought it was dirt, but it's kind of a hole. So that's dirt, that's not. I don't know what that's from. It's not splitting, so I'm gonna have to get an A&P to take a look at that. These were here when I bought the airplane. So these cracks were already stop drilled, and a logbook entry had already been made, so I was fine with it. Also, like I said, with bolts lining up, when you have thread poking out of the bottom of a nut, that's always a good thing. Compare these things. These high shear nuts that hold the stabilator to the torque tube on this Comanche, I always look at. So what I do is I come here, I like to lift this whole stabilator up, and I look at these. I got thread there, I got thread there, I got thread poking up right there, and I got thread poking up right there. I understand it's a little hard to see on the video, but you get the gist of it. When you become familiar with an airplane, you know when something's going wrong. If you're diligent about lines, I'm telling you, it sounds silly, but everything is about lines, approximations, and how things should be lining up. And if they're not lining up, they need to be for a good reason, because if it's loose and it's nuts coming undone, you don't have lines, you don't have thread under that bolt, it could be a problem. When I was learning how to fly, I had an instructor come over here and he told me with the stabilator, he said, come over here and just wiggle that up and down. And I was like, okay, like why? And so when we were doing our pre-flight, he wiggled that up and down and there was some slop, there was some play in it. And what it was there was a, I forget what exactly in the torque tube was going on, but it was causing a little bit of tail flutter when we were flying it. I didn't notice that. We fixed it immediately. This does have the Aussie aftermarket horn, so the AD does not apply to this anymore, and we had that before this problem. So I can't remember for the life of me what ended up being the problem, but it wasn't life or death, but had it gone unnoticed for a long time, this would have gotten enough slop in it where it may have created some kind of flutter. And we know when, if you've ever seen the video that Comanche 400 stabilator that's fluttering, that can be a very deadly situation. So to illustrate my point even further about lines, about proximation, when things are supposed to be lined up, when they're not, I'm over here on the passenger side, co-pilot side, Aileron, and I've never had an issue with this. What I always do is I always look at this jam nut right there, and I look to see I have thread. It's a little hard to see right there. I don't have actually I do have my flashlight. I look at these, so I have thread, everything's lined up, and this is loose, which is appropriate. It's not binding, and nothing is backing out and gonna interfere with anything. What is this, an airport? So going back to the tail, I'm going to show you. Maybe this is just particular to the Comanche, I don't know, but in generalities, these are the kinds of things that you're looking for. One day, I lifted this up here. This is actually in one of my other YouTube videos. These bolts right here are all screwed in. I went to the other side, all screwed in. This one was sticking out quite a ways. I don't know if that bolt has enough thread on it to back out and jam the stabilator, but you can see if that bolt backed out and it jammed the stabilator from going down or from coming up, that potentially could be a deadly situation. I would doubt it. I don't know, I'm not gonna find out. That seems like a pretty amateur engineering move to me, but it's just, it's shit like that that can start backing out and jam certain things. So be diligent on your walk around, look at bolts, look at lines, look at approximations. So I keep talking about lines, when things approximate, when things look level, when you have thread at the end of the bolt, when things aren't loose. This is what I'm talking about. This happened after we replaced our trim tab here. So this is one we replaced, and when I was looking at lines, I noticed, if you can see this, they are slightly misaligned right there. So that's up, this one is down a little bit. I mean, we're talking just a little bit. I haven't noticed anything in flight. Talked to the A&P that installed this, who has been working on this airplane for about 8 years down in French Valley, California. Aircrafters, Bradford is a great dude. We took a look at it. It was within tolerance. There was no issues with any of that. But that's what I'm talking about. The lines, things don't match up when they should, and then you might have a problem. So get your hands on things inside the cowling and on the outside of the airplane. Twist things, torque things. I'm not going to say put your hand on nuts, but put your hands on nuts. What I'm talking about is so inappropriate. But what I'm talking about is I had an issue. You can ask me how I know. My brother was doing touch-and-goes at Catalina, flying out there with a friend. He did a couple landings there before the runway was paved. It was rough as shit. And so the next day I went out there with my wife and we landed, and the first landing I lost the right brake because the bleeder nipple actually ended up vibrating loose. It spilled all the brake fluid on the ground when I had to press the brakes. Only the left one caught, and it flung us into all the tied down airplanes at Catalina. Fortunately, nothing happened. We were able to fly the airplane back to French Valley in Southern California, which is a nice 6,000 foot long runway. It still worked after we tightened the nipple back, but there was a little bit of discrepancy between the travel of the brake. So had I went and put my hands on the little nut fitting, I probably would have been able to unscrew it and then knew that it was supposed to be torqued. I'm going to show you where that is on this airplane. So this is the culprit right here. If I would have just came down here, and this is what I do now, put my hand on that nut and torqued it and wiggled it. This is supposed to be like that, but you wouldn't know it unless you did that. And then all the brake fittings, I really try to get a good handle on, and put your hands on things and torque them, twist them, see if they're loose. If they're at least finger tight, it's not gonna be a problem. But if you notice something that's not finger tight, it's gonna be a problem. And this almost led to a gear collapse because when I went off the field, we were going right towards the airplanes and we were skidding in the dirt off the runway. So it was pretty significant, and that was just one bolt. Had I done a proper pre-flight and really critically thought every nut could possibly be loose, I probably would have caught it. But the trick is to notice when you're getting sidetracked, when all of these things are compiling up to be against you. The trick is not being distracted. The trick is not having all of these things pile up against you. The trick is recognizing in the heat of the moment when you have all this stuff happening. Because when you have the fueler on a common day, fuel truck comes up or you're at the fuel station fueling, one of your friends or it could be anybody come up, start talking to you, you're fueling, you're not paying attention to how much fuel you're putting in. I always dip the tanks and compare when I put fuel in as opposed to how much it actually took, because we have rubber fuel bladders and they can collapse. Things like that, you don't recognize you're getting sidetracked until it's too late. What I compare it to is a slow boil. Where I get the slow boil from is when you boil frogs. I heard this analogy a long time ago. If you throw a frog in a pot of boiling water, he's gonna jump out because instantly there's a huge change. You know something's wrong. But if you put a frog in cold water, you slowly turn that heat on and bring it up to a slow boil. They won't even recognize, and that's how you cook a frog, just in case you wanted to. Situations like flying an airplane can be very, very similar. You don't realize you're becoming distracted until you miss something and you take off with that oil, with that oil dipstick, not all the way screwed in, or with that, when you start the airplane, this hasn't happened to me. It almost did. Where you start that airplane because you're thinking of money or women when you're fueling and you forget to put that static cord back and you leave it on your exhaust pipe and your instructor comes around and he says, hey, don't do that. So you recognize, and by the way, never think about women or money when you're flying because those are just not good subjects. Even if they're good or bad, they take a lot of our brain power to think about. So the trick is to realize when you're becoming distracted, because being distracted is gonna happen. But you have to remember to slow down when you're being distracted. And I can tell you right now, recognizing when you're becoming too distracted is very, very difficult. And the reason being is because you're freaking distracted. So my biggest tip to people doing pre-flights is realize when you're becoming distracted. It's always easy to say, oh, I'm gonna tell my passengers not to pay attention, just to leave me alone, not to come up to me. Dude, it never works out like that, because if you're at an airport, somebody's always coming by. Eventually, somebody that you know is gonna come by and start talking to you, and you're not gonna be a dick to them and say, go stand over there. You might say you're going to, but I can tell you I'm a professional VFR pilot with almost 600 VFR hours. And it always happens. It's going to happen at least once. So be diligent and recognize when you are getting distracted. That's the key to safety, in my opinion.